Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of a grab bag couple of weeks as we go through various tools and approaches. As I say on the page for this week, the consensus building approach really served as a model against which we can compare these other tools and approaches, and I think that's useful. And we'll keep revisiting those various considerations, dimensions, factors, whatever we want to call them, design parameters of tools and approaches as we go along here. Things like representation, things like the nature of decision making, things like linkage to traditional decision making processes. Because those are important, right? Those are the factors we want to be keeping in account or taking into account as we think about different tools and approaches. So the way it's going to work is we will look at these various tools and approaches kind of in very lightning speed, very shallow kind of dive into them over these next couple weeks, as I said. And it will culminate really in 2 weeks from now. What is it? 2.5 weeks from now? Your presentations, your case-based presentations, your videos and handouts for assignment number 4. And that will, of course, serve as a way for everybody to look at some cases, some examples of these various tools, approaches, and practice. But what I'd like to start with is just this brief overview presentation of Chapter 9 from the textbook. Chapter 8, of course, was assigned last week, which already started to get into some of these considerations around process design, tools, and approaches. And the Chapter 9 assigned for this week is Assembly Participation Infrastructure. So very relevant as we think about what does that infrastructure look like of good public participation. And keep in mind that these various tools and approaches, well, a couple of things. One is that they don't all necessarily have the same goals and objectives, but many of them have an eye towards deliberation. We're thinking of these as thick tools and approaches. This is not just about information sharing. It's about thick deliberation. And it's they have some, of course, goal of participation, although they do have very different views on how we involve different people and how we define what stakeholders or the public are. We want to keep in mind. And so with that, let's go through these slides. So in the beginning of the chapter, Nabachi and Leninger assert that more productive forms of participation aren't typically incorporated into the official ways in which we make decisions or engage in quote-unquote participation, whether it's in the education sector, healthcare, land use, or really around any other issues. If you agree with them, which I think frankly would be hard not to, why do you think that might be the case? And of course this is a video, I can't actually hear your responses, but I encourage you to think about that. Why might that be? They also certainly suggest that we should change that, right? That we should embrace the quote-unquote holistic, democratic, citizen-centered views that have emerged over the last few years here in the early 21st century. But there are some questions we need to answer, right? We need to consider, how do the various pieces of a stronger infrastructure fit together? What does a infrastructural system look like? So in other words, not a piecemeal approach to good participation here or there, but a more holistic, integrated network or system of participation. How does that look like, and how does it fit together? What structures and supports need to be in place so that we can have this robust participation on various issues? What does that infrastructure look like? How can people better envision a participation infrastructure? So in other words, how do we involve people in the process of imagining what that might look like, a co-construction, if you will, in a participatory spirit? And last but not least, what should be the guiding principles for the planning of that infrastructure? So what are some of the key building blocks for participation infrastructure? And a lot of this should look familiar. This is very much a culmination of things that have been covered in other chapters in this book and in other readings we've had and lectures and topics we've discussed this semester. Nonetheless, I think it's important to rehash here and to think about how they integrate into this participation infrastructure. So one is certainly mechanisms for disseminating information, to getting information out there on the nature of decisions being made, on what substantive information is being used to inform those decisions, on what decisions have already been made. Basically just, dissemination of information. Second would be gathering input and data. What does our block look like, or infrastructure look like for getting people to provide feedback, to share information that can help us make better decisions? The third is finding ways of discussing and connecting. And that's really where we get into the deliberative, right? How do we connect people together, create venues for deliberation, for discussion? And sometimes those will be at the smaller scale and need to be, as we talked about, thick deliberation often will happen at the smaller scale, or at least with smaller groups, but has to link into larger scale. And so how do we create nested processes, for example, to inform larger scale decision making? And last but not least, this notion of encouraging public work, or encouraging this as a public works project of building this infrastructure. And many communities, as the chapter focuses on, have various settings, processes that can support these building blocks, right? They have things like citizen democracy academies or participatory academies or what have you, ways in which they encourage their citizens, or develop, I shouldn't say encourage, but develop the capacities of their citizens to engage. And they encourage communities to take stock of their assets, decide what's working well, what needs to be upgraded, and where there are gaps. And I think that's really useful and important process to think about. They suggest that there are some quote-unquote universal pieces that can support and connect or foster this kind of participation infrastructure. Things like online networks. The reality is we live hybrid digital lives, and that doesn't have to preclude local attention to local issues or local networks, though, right? We can use online networks to support hyperlocal and local collaboration. But sometimes we need the physical connection, and while COVID has certainly made that harder, I think in many ways it's reminded of us of that. The absence of it sometimes, or the challenges around it, have really accentuated the value of it. And so thinking about things like buildings and physical hubs or spaces for participation. Certainly youth councils as a way to broaden participation to different age groups, to encourage or build that civic capacity starting at a young age. And then last but not least, as I said before, this notion of participation commissions or advisory boards that can really advise local government and others on the design, implementation, evaluation of participation tactics, and on really building those communities and networks of people who can engage, have built good civic capacity in that regard. One thing I would say before I move on is I'd encourage you to think about your community. Where did you grow up? What did it look like there? What was the participation infrastructure? Are you aware of the presence or fairly confident in the absence of these kinds of arrangements? What pieces or institutions or organizations facilitated or encouraged and supported participation in your community, or for that matter, that do in the community you live in now? Imagine Virginia Tech, for example. And that sort of reflection starts to get at something we're going to deal with in seminar this week, or at least for the Monday and Wednesday folks that we're going to deal with in seminar, thinking about what does our infrastructure look like now, and how could we strengthen it? What could we put in place to enhance it, to build it? And I would almost ask you, as a key preliminary question to reflect on in your own is, do you believe it's important to have things like a local participation ordinance? Why or why not? What might they help with, and so on and so forth? The support certainly that Navachi and Leninger suggest is that you can have municipalities have these things like participation ordinances, but that they're getting a little long in the tooth, so perhaps they need to be updated. Certainly there's value in, as we talked about before, this notion of citizen academies and training programs that can be used to inform citizens about the importance of participation, issues of participation, and to help develop their skills. And that there can be dashboards as ways to measure our success, right? We can use that to track data on who turns out, what demographic groups do we see over and underrepresented, and so on and so forth. Some advice that Navachi and Leninger give in how we can envision a stronger participation infrastructure is that we need to make it clear that participation is a cross-sectoral priority. They assert that the language of participation is often not clear or compelling. It fails to capture the full possibility. That we should use more plain, compelling language in that regard. That we should encourage various visions or create a big enough tent that can allow for various visions of participation, including those that we might considered to be more progressive and also more conservative. They suggest that the current language does not necessarily capture those visions. I'm curious if you agree with that, why or why not that might be. And if you do agree, what would be your suggestions for taking participation, participate about participation in ways that is exciting and understandable to people, regardless of, say, their political views. They certainly suggest things like the use of visual aids, things like charts, maps, ways to artistically express the participation infrastructure. And last but not least, this idea of using artistic expression permeates sort of what they're doing. So ways of talking about it, maybe using things like the human body or physical architecture as ways to describe analogies as ways to describe participation infrastructure and the strengthening, weakening, and integratedness or interrelatedness of it. I'd be curious if that resonates with you. What analogy or analogies might you choose to use? They also introduced this notion or idea of small d democratic planning for small d democratic infrastructure. And so instead of focusing on this grand plan for what a participatory infrastructure looks like, that we need instead to think about smaller plans that are united through some common principles and practices, like the emphasis on crossing silos within government, across various agencies, levels of government perhaps, and of course with experts and wider stakeholders. This notion of focusing on and articulating a broader context and reasons why people should participate, would want to participate. Tapping into where citizens are already assembled, acknowledging that we don't have to start from scratch, that people do engage, that there are networks, that there are communities in this sort of small c sense that we can tap into. But that we can also find and create new settings that can be creative and compelling. That we should map the infrastructure we have in ways that are transparent and responsive, that we can build databases on the community and its residents, that we should facilitate accountability as much as possible, and then we have to have good ways of measuring participation. And apropos the comment I made on the last slide or slide before that on not just measuring but sharing that data, right? What does our participation success and failure look like? And so something else Nabachi and Leninger suggests is that participation infrastructure, there are multiple ways in which we can construct it, but that it has to, at its core, both work for the individuals, that is to say the public or publics that it serves, and of course for the institutions, the organizations that are going to be nurturing it, that are contained within it. And I say this hoping that many of you may have chances to work on participation infrastructure in the future. It may not be your full-time job or anything, but that as part of organizations, be they public, private, nonprofit, that are engaged in some way or another in participatory processes, internally or externally, that you think about the ways in which the infrastructure can and should be constructed to meet those to have a sufficient value proposition for those that need to be engaged, whether they're within your organization or external actors. And there are some questions we might ask or use as benchmarks to measure whether or not we're meeting that value proposition, right? Why would people care about this? How will it serve their needs or our needs as citizens? Why would they participate? And how can we make the process work for everybody involved, public officials, public employees, other stakeholders, so that it's as easy as possible, as effective as possible, and it sounds weird to say, but as gratifying as possible. And so at the end of the day, we need to think about, above all, what does the infrastructure look like, participatory infrastructure look like, that's going to reflect the needs and goals of the public, right, of ordinary people. And that this is, through asking these questions, that we can generate a broader understanding and true ownership of processes, and that's really integral to success. Is how the value, to use the term I used on the last slide, that the value proposition is there, and that people feel some ownership over it. And that last but not least, and this is also important, we're talking about public participation. So there's a deep irony in talking about participation, but neglecting to think about the participatory way in which we can build the infrastructure itself. So how do we engage folks in not only the participation once we have the infrastructure in place, but in the actual construction of the participatory infrastructure itself, the means of participation, the standards, the expectations of participation. All right, so that's just a quick overview from Chapter 9. The other videos this week are going to be videos on each of the tools approaches, not by me. They're ones on the various tools approaches. But I hope they give you at least a sort of snapshot of what each is. As I said before, this is what it's going to look like for the next couple of weeks, and it's all in culmination, or going to culminate rather, in your brief videos, which I'm excited to see, your handouts, which I'm also excited to see, on the various tools approaches we're going to cover. So with that, here we go into some tools and approaches.